Monsieur Vice-Président, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, it is an honor to address the 59th session of the Human Rights Council as the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of the internally displaced persons. Today, I present my 4th annual report and the Council Resolutions 56, along with findings from my country visit to the Marshall Islands. Every time since taking up my mandate, I have stood before this Council to report a new global record in the number of IDPs. Sadly, this year is no exception. Over 83 million people are living in internal displacement worldwide. I repeat, 83 million people. Conflict and violence remain the primary cause of displacement, and their consequences are increasingly severe as we witness a global decline in support for the international norms and standards foundational to human rights and the rule of law. Displacement is no longer just a consequence of conflict. It is increasingly its deliberate objective. In regions like Sudan, Palestine, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we witness conflict parties and occupying powers systematically uprooting communities to alter the demographic landscape. IDPs and their settlements are no longer spared. They are being treated as though they were military targets. Humanitarian access, which remains a legal obligation, is now a bargaining chip for political and financial gain. And it's not just conflict. The adverse effects of climate change and disasters are also displacing people at record levels. At the end of 2024, 10 million people were displaced by disasters. This crisis knows no borders. While low-income countries and small island states are often hardest hit, the United States recorded the most disaster displacement last year. These are not just numbers. They are lives disrupted, futures derailed, and rights denied. But they are also stories of resilience, of individuals, families, communities, nations striving to rebuild, to reclaim dignity, and restore hope for them and for humanity. We must not let these stories be buried under statistics. We must act. Monsieur Président, Vice-Président, at the invitation of the government, I conducted an official visit to the Marshall Islands last October, and I thank the government for their cooperation. I would also like to thank the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo for their full support to my recent visit. That report will be presented to the Human Rights Council at its 62nd session in next June. The Marshall Islands faces a triple displacement crisis, from nuclear testing, military use of land, and the adverse effects of climate change. From 1947 until 1986, under US administration as part of the United Nations Strategic Trust Territory of the Pacific, US nuclear tests displaced indigenous communities without free, prior, and informed consent required under international law. Those relocated faced starvation, disasters, loss of livelihood, identity, and culture. Communities were also displaced from Kwajalein Atoll for a US military base that remains active today. To date, neither the US nor the UN has issued a formal apology to the Marshallese. The Marshall Islands faces existential climate threats, despite contributing minimally to global emissions. It suffers increasing displacements from storms, floods, droughts, and rising sea levels could render much of the countries uninhabitable by the end of the century. I commend them for their pursuit for justice for nuclear victims and its climate leadership. It was the first nation to submit an ambitious nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement and has developed a national climate strategy and adaptation plan through inclusive and participatory processes. I encourage them to continue progress through a rights-based approach to displacement, stronger disaster response, and a land reform. But the Marshall Islands also need strong international support through emission cuts, as well as funding and technical assistance to implement its climate strategy. The United States holds a particular responsibility to declassify relevant records, reconsider and resolve claims, and ensure future agreements meet the standard of free, prior, and informed consent. Mr. President, once again, we are seeing now communities being displaced under the pretext of nuclear threats, no longer a past concern. but a present and urgent driver of forced displacement. States must ensure safety and humanitarian access. Distinguished delegates, let me now turn to the focus of my thematic report. Organized criminal activity is an increasingly prevalent driver of displacement and violations of the rights of IDPs across the world. In 2024, at least 1.2 million people were displaced by climate-related violence, more than double the figures of 2023. Violence leading to displacement in such contexts may rise from criminal actors seeking to control territory, populations, illicit economies, or from disputes between criminal groups. State responses are often weak or complicit. Militarized state security operations worsen the situation in many cases, punishing victims and fueling further displacement. This is especially true where states derogate from their human rights obligations during declared states of emergency. While the state has the primary responsibility to prevent and address criminal activity and internal displacement, the emergence of significant organized criminal activity can indicate the inability or the unwillingness of the state to effectively enforce the rule of law and seek accountability. IDPs in this context face grave violations of human rights, including murder, violent assault, kidnapping, forced labor, child recruitment, sexual exploitation. They also risk becoming collateral damage in armed confrontations between criminal actors. Robbery, extortion, land expropriation stifle commercial activity and imperil the livelihoods of those affected. These dynamics also restrict access to essential services, including health, education, and hinder development. This crisis thrives in impunity and erodes the legitimacy of the states. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion that prevails degrades the social fabric as communities fracture and turn against each other, with some IDPs facing distinct vulnerabilities and intersecting forms of discrimination. These dynamics, coupled with the persistent insecurity generated by criminal activity, frustrate the search for durable solutions. I recognize that effectively addressing organized criminal activity is a complex process cutting across humanitarian, human rights, and criminal law. The actors involved are diverse in motivation and structure, requiring nuanced responses. I urge states to tackle root causes, such as poverty, corruption, and weak rule of law. States should also adopt protection-centered strategies in responses to criminal violence and displacement, and invest in accountability, access to justice, and durable solutions. Measures to ensure the disarmament, reintegration of armed groups and criminal actors and foster social cohesion are also crucial to rebuild the social contract in these settings. Excellencies, as I reach the end of my first term, one thing is clear. The rise in global displacement is the result of systemic failure. The failure of states and the international community to tackle its root causes. In conflict zones, we have seen blatant violations of international humanitarian and human rights law over the past years. Yet the perpetrators have enjoyed effective impunity and continue to expand their campaigns of aggression. On climate change, states have underinvested in disaster risk reduction and have failed to sufficiently reduce their emissions, curtail the use of fossil fuels, and fallen short on mitigation and adaptation. As global displacement reaches record levels, funding for protection and durable solutions is collapsing, even from states that have historically led with solidarity during global crisis. I have witnessed the devastating consequences of these cuts firsthand. I urge member states to sustain and increase support, enabling the UN, national, international NGOs, and organizations working with IDPs to uphold human rights for all. Enough is enough. The tools to prevent this crisis already exist. What's missing is the political will. Now it's not the time to retreat into narrow interests or abandon our commitment to solidarity. Internally displaced people need us more than ever. I call on member states in this room, act decisively, end complacency, end complicity. The time to stand with internally displaced people is now. I thank you for the support to my mandate, and I look forward to a fruitful, interactive dialogue.